The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.
Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. This week on The Unlikely Innovators, Mike, we had Dave Salmoni, who is a zoologist and animal expert from TV.
Steve, you outdid yourself with that intro. I think Dave would be proud.
Yeah, well, we did talk about lions, tigers, and bears in this episode because, of course, we had Dave on, who's interacted with each of those species of animal, both on TV and in his professional life. It was just great to have him on. It's, again, one of those moments where you have to almost pinch yourself that you have someone like that on there. You've seen him on TV. I know him from, of course, one of my favorite shows from times gone by called Animal Face Off, which we talk about in the pod. But yeah, just great time to have him on.
Yeah, I was going to say he's probably one of the few people in the world to have on the podcast who, when you take that line of lions, tigers, and bears, to have been attacked by all of those animals. Although we didn't get a confirmation on a tiger attack, but we certainly did talk about the time he was attacked by a grizzly bear and a lion. So yeah, no, it was just a really great conversation because obviously I think you and I had our jaws on the floor when he's kind of going through the details of I think some of these more grizzly encounters, if I can use a pun there, with some of these animals. But I think what's really inspiring about Dave is that he has these stories, and you've watched the videos where he evades a potential shark attack or he evades a potential lion attack, but despite the danger that he constantly puts himself in, he still loves what he does, right? He still loves all of these animals. If it's an elephant or a lion, like he still is, I think, passionate about understanding these animals, getting a better sense of their behaviors and how they can interact with humans. And so I think at the end of the day, like he had a message at the end about having, just trying to not chart your path too rigidly so that you can find what you're passionate about. But I think with him, it's just really neat to see how after a lot of these experiences, I think somebody like you or I would be like, I got attacked by a lion, I'm out. I'm finding a desk job somewhere. I'm keeping all of the meat in my forearm intact. But he understands the risks, obviously, but at the same time, I think he knows that it's what he's passionate about, and he loves what he does.
Yeah, and I mean, what a cool local connection too. I mean, to Laurentian, where he studied zoology, and of course, we got to bring up Joe Hammer, who looms large in the halls of Cambrian College. But anyways, let's hear more from Dave. I think he has a lot to say, and we packed a lot in, so enjoy. We're now back with Dave Salmoni. Dave is a television host, producer, zoologist, animal adventure expert. He's been working in front and behind the camera since 1998. His work has ranged from wildlife and adventure to competition reality, talk shows, and he's been a regular on news outlets for everything and anything animal. Dave has worked for Animal Planet, the Discovery Channel, since 2000, and has also hosted shows on ABC and W networks. He is Animal Planet's large predator expert and is host of several Animal Planet and Discovery Network international programs. He's a regular news source for anything related to wildlife, both captive and in the wild. Some of Dave's most recent work has been very diverse. While continuing to work on adventure wildlife series, he's also started Deadly Islands. He's branched out to home improvement competition, which is, I think, where we're getting the interior design stuff from, Dave. And then he's also merged those two most recently with a new show called Pet Nation Renovation. So we're really pleased to have Dave on the show. Thanks for stopping by.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Our pleasure, Dave. So, one of the first questions we always like to ask our guests is to kind of talk about how they got into the fields that they did. And I think that in looking at the longer version of your bio, we kind of came across that, you discovered your passion for wildlife at an early age. I guess, like, what drew you to animals and wildlife? And as a kid, we think about things that you want to be when you grow up, but did you ever think that this would be what you do for a living? Or did you always know as young as 7 years old that, like, I love animals and wildlife, I'm going to get into this somehow, and you just made it happen?
Yeah, I think those are two questions. I think that the passion is just one of those things that always was. I believe most people who have those types of passions from childhood probably don't have a moment. Maybe there's their first memory of it, but they don't have a moment where all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I think I like this thing. So animals, I always connected with, I always enjoyed. They were just something that drew me to them always. So I guess innately there is just something that passion lives in. Career-wise, it's no. I don't believe anybody at 2 years old, which is probably my earliest memory of liking animals, is thinking career. Even as late as first year university, for me, I wasn't really thinking career. You're just going interest path. I was luckily enough not somebody who had some design up ahead of me. It was more, what am I interested in? What seems to be fun? The best part about not exceeding people's expectations is that those expectations kind of leave you alone. You can kind of let them happen for yourself, rather than I imagine if you're in grade 9 and you're told you're the best mathematician out there, maybe you want to go into actuarial math, or you're told you're the greatest writer I've ever seen at grade 9. Oh, you're going to be, you become a writer and you tell yourself that's what you're going to be. And I think that can be great for people who find that fulfilling, but I think it also can be something that makes your view too narrow. So answer, I didn't think about career until in fact, I had 2 mortgages before I ever thought, oh crap, this is my career. This is my job. My job, when I was in my mid 30s, and every job was like, oh, well, this job will take me to this point. At the end of every TV show, you're unemployed. So it doesn't feel like a career, not like in the sense that we're used to them, where you got security of any kind. Like I would get a contract, and that contract would be a year-ish, maybe a year and a half-ish. And so as a 20-year-old, of course, you're not thinking to yourself, oh, this is going to be forever. I'm just going to tie a whole bunch of these together. And then, okay, you do tie a bunch of them together, and then you keep going, and there's still more there, and you get better at it. And I think eventually it becomes something that, oh, shoot, I've got responsibilities, I've got mortgages, I've got nothing else I'm really good at. This is my career. So the job, oddly, yes, I took jobs, but I didn't ever think of the job until it was already like I was 10 years away from retirement by the time I figured it was my job.
That's really good. So let's dig. I want to tap into one thing that I noticed from your bio. I mean, how does one draw a line from Sarnia, Ontario to, let's say you're in grade 12 or grade 13 at the time in Ontario, and you're thinking, what am I going to do next year or the next time I'm in the education system? How do you throw a dart on the dartboard and end up at Laurentian University taking zoology? Mike and I are both Laurentian grads, and we love Laurentian. But how did that? So talk us through that process.
That's the easiest question I think you'll have today. I had a family. I grew up with a family cottage on the French. So French River is about 40 minutes from Sudbury. My uncle, I don't know exactly his role there. I think he was the head of kinesiology. If he wasn't the head of kinesiology, he was definitely a professor of kinesiology there. So I had a connection there, start to finish. And once again, when you're not going because you have this path in mind. I didn't go to university because I was like, oh, okay, you get your good marks, you go to this school because all the people from Sarnia are saying that this is the most important school to go to for this subject. I think that we get caught up in all that. I just said, oh man, I love it up north. I got a cottage up there. I'd seen the campus because we used to do like a fun family race out of the sports center there in the summers. I was like, man, that campus is in the middle of the bush and there's animals. And I mean, if that's what you're interested in, there can't be a better place to take zoology than a place where there's animals. And I think that a lot of people that go to you name the school, I don't want to insult anybody, but name the school, and they are realizing that, oh, how did you get to do your honors thesis tracking black bears? I'm like, well, there's black bears all around. So it's pretty stinking easy. You can't go to some of these Southern Ontario schools that maybe they're harder to get into, but they certainly don't learn as much.
Hey, let me ask you this. Do you know Joe Hammer?
Do I know Joe Hammer?
It was good because he used to be, so he taught at Cambrian where I am here, and we were office mates. Like he was next door to me.
You have not been doing your reading. I'm sure in that bio, Joe's name comes up.
Well, it doesn't, but
the Elks do. The Elks
we knew for sure there had to be a Joe Hammer connection just based on, the bear tracking and then also the immobilization stuff. Like that was, Joe.
You boys are very young and you do not, I don't know what professors are there when you guys were there or if you took zoology, but certainly Frank Mallory was the large mammal guy at the Laurentian. He and I became friends probably into my first year and taught me some pretty significant lessons as to what made me successful outside of the academic side of it. We can get into that at some point. But obviously Joe and Frank friendships and relationships. So at the time, and I don't know if it still is or was, but Joe was at Cambrian and a professor there, and he had a bunch of projects with the MNR, and they were in partnership with Laurentian and Frank Mallory. And my connection to Joe was through Frank. And in fact, Joe, I think he's got a home 10 minutes from my cottage.
Yeah, he does.
Which
Did you ever go on any sled dog rides? Did he ever have you out for that?
No.
Oh. Yeah, Joe's the man for sure.
Yeah. So anytime during school, we would do like deer check stations. We did a big project where we introduced 400 elk into just outside of Killarney near Burwash.
Yeah.
My bear thesis, all that was connected with Joe. So, you know, he and I weren't spending much time together because I was at Laurentian, he was at Cambrian, and I was a lowly student and he was busy. But yeah, we definitely have a connection there.
Well, I think we have a connection there as well. And so I wanted to ask you this question because there was a time in my life where like I was called the bear guy, but not for the reasons that you might be called the bear guy.
Ah.
I didn't actually study them in the wild. I did a history dissertation about the history of black bear management in Ontario. And so like Frank Mallory and Joe Hammer came up a lot in some of the papers they've written over the years, some of the studies they've done. But we wanted to ask you because admittedly, despite being called the bear guy by family and friends, and, you know, they had this thing where every time there was a black bear piece of, memorabilia, they would get it. And my wife eventually over time was like, can you tell them to stop giving you bear stuff? So it became this thing where I was the bear guy, but I admittedly didn't have any really good bear stories. Despite living in Sudbury, you'd see the odd bear here or there, but like presumably during that your honors thesis where you're working with black bears, we had to ask you like, what's your best bear story, either from Sudbury or just through your travels in the wilds throughout your career?
Man, there's a myriad of answers to that question, and they always revolve around getting bit or almost getting bit, of course. So if I was to peruse over top of them, I would say I've once been grabbed in the skull by a grizzly bear and dragged off into the bush. That was a big story. I once was on live TV where the host was a girl that I was living with, and a bear almost took my thumb off on TV. And then my best honors thesis story, and I remember it the most vividly because it was pre all of this close contact stuff. If you reverse all the way to Laurentian in fourth year, I would have been just like anybody else in fourth year university, trying to make it work, trying to have a beer, trying to get my thesis done. So my experience of going face to face with animals was none, really, besides dogs and cats. And I remember, so obviously my project, for those who are listening, it was a nuisance bear project. So we had some bears that were caught that were considered free-ranging wild bears that were natural behaving, whereas the nuisance bears were ones that the Meminar had been called, asked to trap, and then re-released. And we were trying to get a sense for what the best management skills or methods would be. So I knew a couple of the bears by paper. This is a very big bear. This bear showed aggression in its history, blah, blah, blah. And if you know anything about radio telemetry, what you kind of do is you kind of go into where the home range of that bear is, and you put up a little aerial, and it gives you a directional line to where the collar is that the bear is wearing. So you go to your favorite spot, you climb up on a hill, you go and you're like, okay, you get your compass out 270 degrees from where I'm standing. Then you go and you get 3 of those points, and you can kind of triangulate where that bear is. So you can kind of tell how far away based on the noise that your telemetry machine is doing. So I have my favorite spot, and this is the bear that I know to be most aggressive. And I'm pretty sure at that point, I'm getting that, little student, hey, everybody, be careful of this bear. What's your bear safety plan? I mean, I don't think we got lots of it. We got enough of it that I was warned about this bear, I think. And I remember turning on my machine, it's screaming, and knowing from the numbers I was receiving that this bear was within 6 to 8 feet of me. I had no idea where it was. I'm standing in the middle of the bush, looking left, looking right. Like, you can't imagine the scary feeling of, okay, like I know I could probably grab you if I saw, but I cannot find it. So even then trying to figure out, okay, how do I exit? There's a bear here. He's not letting me know. He's not growling at me, puffing at me. He's not run off. All those things sound pretty dangerous to me. Those are not natural things. I bumped into 1,000 bears at this point, and they all kind of have the same reaction. And I'm like, okay, well, if I don't know where it is, how the heck I don't know where to back out. So obviously at that point, you just kind of follow the track. You just hope if he tolerated you in, he tolerates you out, and you back through the same path that you took on the way there. But never saw that bear, but remember that feeling of like, holy shit.
Yeah, it's dread.
Well, I think I think that fills me with dread right now thinking about that. But we got to go back and ask about, you said the first story you mentioned was getting dragged away, by the skull by a grizzly bear. Like, how did you get out of that one? I guess is the question we'd obviously have to ask.
Enough to be sitting right next to a bear trainer. So a buddy of mine was with me, and we were in bear country because we knew we were, and it was a young bear, and he was right next to me. So when he grabbed me, and you could hear the teeth scrape along the top of my skull as he dragged me back. Because I bet you I was around the same weight as the bear. The bear was only like a 250 pound bear. And I think the bear knew he had to get me away from my buddy as quick as possible. So snuck up behind me. Neither one of us heard him. Grabbed me, went that way. And when my buddy got up, I think my buddy might have like smacked him on the ass or yelled at him, or I can't remember, but he got involved. And then the bear let me go and ran off.
I can't even imagine. And then like the courage, your buddy was a trainer, thank God.
Yeah, so he wasn't nervous to jump in. And
yeah.
When you train 1,000-pound bears, a 200-pound bear, you're like, come on, little guy, get the hell out of here. It'd be no different if a young tiger came and attacked one of you guys. It would scare the crap out of you, but it wouldn't bother me at all. Like, little kitty, leave him alone.
Yeah. It reminds me of that scene in The Revenant when that bear drags poor Leo DiCaprio out of frame.
That bear I know, and that bear is a lot bigger than 200 pounds.
Yeah, I bet. No doubt. Yeah, I bet you we don't have to talk about that, but I bet you there's there's not too many bears you see on screen. You could almost probably pick them out as the ones, right?
The big feature films for sure, because, the best of the best, those feature films can really only afford the best of the best, because it's one, it has to be dramatic, and what might be expensive to a bear trainer is not to a feature film.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a matter of trust. I think that if there's like 2 or 3, depending on the species of animal, the trainers that just kind of have the reputation of, I've done this a bunch of times, the insurance companies can kind of trust those types of people. So once you have that reputation, that's kind of what you sell on. But certainly it's also a certain skill. That kind of thing is a rare skill, and there's only a few people that kind of have it. And maybe there's lots of people out there that are born with it, but they certainly don't get exposed to it, so never get to to know that you're very good at bear training or tiger training or elephant training, whatever it happens to be. So that kind of thing, it's a very small community. Particularly in my world, I have to work with lots of them, so you get to meet them over the years for sure.
I'll bet. So just we kind of skipped ahead, but I just wanted to sort of posit this, and I'll get your view on it. But the overwhelming majority of zoologists or people who took zoology in university don't become celebrity animal experts. So can you shed a little bit of light on how you transitioned to the work you were doing in your thesis, and then just if you can, in sort of a few steps, take us to how that gets to sort of the first job in front of the camera. How does that work?
It's certainly, I'll breeze through it, and you guys can drill down into anything you guys find interesting. Like every story at my age, you have the long version and the short version. So Laurentian, we've already got to. Bear thesis, we've got to. It was around that time that I finally had realized I was good at school. So obviously, Revenge of the Sea student that we talked about off camera. There's a certain point in your life where you realize just being good at academia isn't something that is going to run you through life. You have to have other skills, other abilities, and certainly in zoology and biology, personal skills are important, because if everybody's got the same piece of paper, but this guy with the job is going to have to share a tented camp with you for 6 to 8 weeks, you're going to have to be likable. You're going to have to be someone you're going to have beer with, and that's a skill that I learned at Laurentian, luckily, as we all did at the pub. So I was starting to realize I was good at academia. I was one like everybody else, there's 400 people in your first year bio class. And then I think I graduated with 30 people or 28 people or something like that. So if you can make it through, you are probably pretty good. That thesis was obviously a sought after thesis, and it was received well. There was a lot of suggestion that I continue to master's and PhD. But I did realize that the more people that are on that path, the people giving me that advice were in the lab. In fact, I saw more bears than they did because I was the young grunt being asked to go tromps around in the snow. And in my head, I'm like, I don't want to become you. I don't want to be the guy sending people to go tromps around chasing bears. I want to be go chasing bears. So I didn't know career-wise, but I wanted to go work with animals. As a young guy from Sarnia, lived in a cul-de-sac in a little normal town. I don't know where you go to work with animals. So I said, well, let's go to a zoo. Frank and Joe had introduced me to a chemical immobilization course. At that course, there was the head of the Toronto Zoo. So I got an interview doing that. So I went there and they said, listen, like zookeeping isn't for you. People with degrees don't really they get bored as a zookeeper. And I said, well, I still like to try it. So he said, well, I know a privately owned zoo that might be more your speed. Another friend of mine, and in fact, my brother's father-in-law said I knew somebody, and it turned out to be the same guy. So I got an interview there. So straight out of Sudbury, I went with thesis in hand in a full suit to a privately owned zoo and tried to, get a job. I got hired, and he said, listen, put your thesis away, put your suit away. You're 220 pounds. You look like you can scoop a lot of poop. Get to work. So luckily at that place, this owner really believed that the captive environment wasn't a healthy one for the brains of all these animals. So these animals needed to get outside their enclosures and be exposed to things and really challenge their minds. So he didn't want to have animals that didn't get the opportunity to go out and have fun. So at this place, I flourished. Eventually, I had an encounter with a lion where he said, oh man, that's clearly lions like you and you like lions. So I became the big cat guy there. So my days would literally just be taking lions for walks, tigers for swims, exercising them, putting away, feeding them, and carrying on. So I became a big cat trainer in that way. There was a gentleman from South Africa who was really involved with the ecotourism model and developing that in Africa, where partnering with the local people and creating jobs was the way that they were saving their big cats. He then wanted to export that to China by building an example in Africa. So he came out to Canada, and through a bunch of different things, he asked me to come out there and try to train captive bred tigers to be released into a park that he would build. So take, land where there's no animals at all, fence it, build the wildlife back, and then put an exotic predator in there to then export to Asia and say, hey, we think this is a good way for you to save your big cats. I was successful with that. That's where TV came and found me. But even still, that probably doesn't give the full answer, because at that point, they didn't offer a career. As I said, they filmed me, they paid me a few bucks. I trained these tigers to kill things. That took me 5 years. We sold that project to China, and then there's no job. So like some TV exec says like, hey, what are you gonna do now? And I had some idea where I thought I could make friends with the Pride of Lions. I had an experience with the Pride of Lions a year before, and I really thought I had this method that I could get them to accept me. So he's like, oh, I'd film that. So that's how I started my production company. That's how my second film project came. And then I got kind of caught up into this whole idea of let's just imagine the craziest, most fun thing I could do and see if someone will pay me for it. And so TV became, you remember this was a time when Steve Irwin was the top of the ratings of television, right? So me being a couple of tiers down below Steve was the front of that genre of TV. There was an unlimited amount of work. So I could literally just finish a job and say, oh, you know what? Sharks. I hear there's a guy swimming with great white sharks, and I really want to see if the guy's a crazy idiot or if there's an intelligent way to interact with these massive animals, and so on and so forth. And then of course, that's when the TV and the career kind of goes, because then at a certain point you become an asset to a network, and then the network kind of has more influence as to what. So hey, you do this show that maybe is not your passion, but then we'll give you a passion one. And then you're doing press, and then social media gets developed, and then you're doing all of that. And so the career itself is a snowball, but that would be sort of the impetus of just kind of a young guy's imagination of what could I try and what could I get paid for? What would you pay for? I'm gonna go live on an island somewhere. You go pay for that. And then eventually it's like, oh crud, this is my career. And then that's a whole different discussion at that point.
Well, one of the things I want to pick up from that is obviously, like, you'd mentioned you had these ideas and the networks agreed that, like, we'd like to film that. But in terms of you transitioning to being in front of the camera, was that something that came naturally to you? I mean, you hear a lot of people say, like, I can do interviews, but once you turn the camera on, I get shy. But then again, a lot of people don't, train big cats or work with bears like you. So maybe you don't have the same kind of fears or getting nervous about being in front of the camera. But what was it like going, I guess, from academia to zookeeper to now you're on front of the camera? Was it a natural transition for you, or did you have a bit of a learning curve with that as well?
Interestingly, with animals, you're always the B character anyway, so you never really feel like the focal point.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that nerves, like, I mean, obviously I haven't now in my 20 years of work had to stand in front of a camera and it's all me, say these lines and make it work. But for 10 years, I bet I was always just the guy explaining what's happening or explaining what's going on. And because of that, you're hiding behind a lion or a tiger so the thing that might cause nerves doesn't exist because there's no pressure. It's not you that they're really focused on. They're focused on what's happening. And I'm just kind of explaining it to you.
Mm-hmm.
I was quite good at what I was doing. So I found that part easy. If you're just kind of explaining the information, it would be like any business. If some person who doesn't know anything about your business is like, holy shit, what's happening there? And you're just kind of going through the basics. Okay, what you're seeing and what you're about to see is going to be this. And so that was my job for a long time until eventually it just was. It was such a gradual occurrence. Certainly I can remember some things more nerve-wracking than others. Like I can remember maybe when you present your thesis back in university, like I think I remember being nervous for that. Whereas now, like being in front of a group of 30 to 300 to 3,000, I wouldn't even consider the nerves of it.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember like the first big talk show, like the one that sticks out for me, like doing the Tonight Show pretty regularly. I was young and it was early in my career. I do remember at times those being nervous moments because it's a completely different thing. You're in the entertainment world at that point. You're not just in the bush with your pals with the camera over your shoulder. So I think that maybe different things would cause different people nerves. I don't know now what would cause me nerves. Probably almost nothing camera related.
Yeah.
But yeah, the transition was so gradual and so not about me anyway that you just didn't feel it until it'd been going on for 5 or 6 years. And then at that point, it's just like talking to a camera. And at that point, I'd lived by myself in a tent for that long, talking to anybody that would listen to me.
Well, one of the threads I did want to kind of see if there's anything there was, obviously you'd mentioned the work that you did on the Tonight Show and the wild animals segment with Jimmy Kimmel. But when you were younger, did you watch people like Jack Hanna and the appearances that he used to do on Letterman and things like that? Or was that just kind of, it just all happened and maybe Jack Hanna wasn't, a fixture in your life when you're growing up?
Yeah, I remember it. Like, obviously I was more in the documentary space than I was the David Letterman space. I certainly didn't have parents that would allow me to stay up late at night.
Yeah.
Oddly, my first talk show ever was Letterman, which caused some friction with Letterman with Hanna that I had no idea because I didn't understand the business yet. But you can imagine Jack, who'd been their animal fixture for however many years. Then all of a sudden he turns on the TV one day and some young guy's got a tiger on his show. So I do have a fun little, frictional story back with him, but yes, I was aware of that stuff, but I don't think I can ever remember a specific moment that it was like, oh, that's what did it for me. Those types of segments and my fun in them more came out of my own growth, meaning like I did that Letterman one, I never did it again. And then I got, a regular spot on Tonight Show. And then obviously my time with Jimmy. Eventually those things just became work that didn't feel like work. Like it's a lot harder to go out and do a documentary and get get kicked in. And in my case, for 15 years, my life was always at risk. And, you're not eating well and you're not sleeping well and you're in these uncomfortable places. And on top of it, you got a whole crew behind you moaning the whole time, thinking that you're not going through the same stuff. So those entertainment things eventually became these fun little reprieves and moments out of the bush. And there's drinks of any kind, there's food, there's air conditioning, there's, all these one comfortable things. And the most dangerous thing is some little thing that you hold this big. And even if a tiger was to, shake a chunk out of my shoulder. It's like, man, it's not even the worst thing that's happened this week. So I always enjoyed those for those reasons. And typically, eventually, you make friends with the crew. You make friends with the hosts, and those friendships are fun because you haven't seen, like Jimmy and I used to do a segment every 3 times a year. So like, every 3 or 4 months, you kind of bump into them and catch up a little bit, and all that stuff becomes more about the friendships and seeing your pals and doing your stuff than really the feeling of work. Even though it probably was more what I got paid for than, other than the last 5 years anyway, like my career was far more about that side of my job than the more arduous stuff.
Yeah, I mean, any of those sort of late night shows, one of my favorite spots was definitely when they had animals on, because you got to see the host really squirm, especially when you could tell that, like, when they have like a phobia. I can't remember if it was Kim or one of them was like really afraid of snakes, and I remember seeing that, and you can see like, oh, is that right? Because you could see it's like visceral from them, like you're not joking anymore when
no, that's exactly right. Like Jimmy would, and that's how I kept my job, was because it was weaving that. The crew wants to see, the audience wants to see him have a natural, real reaction.
Yeah.
But the boss is Jimmy. So I would always quietly have my own conversations with Jimmy, like, hey, here are the things that are going to keep you safe. And I never got him bit. I never got him hurt. I never let him get to the point where he thought that I was out of control. Mm-hmm. And he often would say, the only reason you have this job over all of the other people we used to have on here is just because you're big. You look like you have the control that I need. But I can remember my very first segment with him. I had like 6 animals, and they said, hey, by the way, don't let those animals get too close to Jimmy. He's allergic. So like a normal scientist, like somebody with a brain, would be like, okay, which one's he allergic to? And the answer was all of them. Like, oh, really? So how many tigers has he been in touch with that he realized he was like, that must be a very difficult thing to realize how you are now. But then after I got to know him a little bit better, I realized that allergy was a nicer way of saying he is scared shitless and doesn't really want to do the segment we're making.
Yeah, it's the same way my dad's allergic to cucumbers, right? He's not, but he just hates them. Yeah. So this is a bit selfish on my part, but I actually, for a time, was obsessed with Animal Face-Off.
Oh, yeah.
And I want, if you will indulge me, can you talk a bit about how that show came to be? Because it's really like, the knowledge of animals and how they interact with animals, and then sort of engineering side, bringing those two together, and then how would they interact in the wild, like animals that would never meet. Could you talk a bit about like that show? And then I want you to settle a debate between Mike and I after.
Oh, I have the answers to all these questions. And that debate that you're talking about, I imagine, is the why we built the show. Is that everybody, that's almost, have you been bit? And who would win in a fight? Like, those are the questions you get. Yeah. Like, Discovery and Animal Planet, back in my impetus, was pub questions. Always like, smart, intelligent pub questions generally. What's the interest? So that's what that show was. It was basically trying to figure out who's going to win in a fight between these two things, and can you justify it? Like, it's almost like a first-year university question, like, hey, and justify your answer. So, we would get two experts of a particular species, and then they would be the champion of that species as to why their species would win it in that fight. The engineering side of it was just a way to sort of attempt to calculate it. Let's put some quantifiable in a completely unquantifiable question. So the question itself, the only reason I got to do the show was I had been bashed around by tigers and had to have spinal surgery. So the doctors had told me that I wasn't allowed to work with my tigers. So being off, but also under contract, Discovery's like, ooh, shit, we got a show that we really need you to be on and help add some energy. So it was just a boys club show. You kind of wanted to go there. You kind of have a great laugh. You really try to the element that I liked was, as a host, was kind of the sports side of it, meaning like championing, cheerleading for your animal. Your animal is a wimp. It's only this many pounds. Your animal couldn't do this. If my animal gets a hold of that. So, a lot of the questions that we asked kind of were unanswerable, but with my background, I always had the trump card, because listen, I've been attacked by that and that. I'm telling you, that's tougher. But yeah, it was a fun show.
Yeah. So, and I think that's what I found compelling about it too. At a younger age, was just, it's the ones in the playground or the ones, on the bus where it's like, I think an eagle could beat a hawk or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But Mike and I were thinking about when we're planning some questions for you. And then I said, well, obviously a grizzly bear, or I think I was on the polar bear side.
I said polar bear because
Okay,
my
okay.
argument was that largest land carnivore, and then you said you went with grizzly bear.
That's right. I said, obviously a grizzly bear will beat a polar bear, and he's like, whoa, I don't think it's obvious.
Okay.
So what do you think on that?
Well, I have some real specific thoughts about that. That's a much easier question than what I thought you'd give me. Why would you think? What differentiates polar from grizzly in your mind?
My mind was like the polar bear is bigger, so it's got more power behind it. But that's as far as we got into. We didn't really get into a full-fledged debate because we wanted to kind of save it.
I think that it is truthfully that's a wash, because the largest bear in the world individually is a brown bear. The largest individual bear ever found was a brown bear, but largest by average, absolutely polar. Polars are known 100% if it's alive, I'm going to try and kill it. Whereas browns are very relaxed. They're very smart. I would always say the smarter animal always wins. And in that case, I would say grizzly. But I would say it's a crapshoot because they're the same animal. If you skin those two animals at the same weight, you don't see a difference. Really? Now, the difference, you can say the same about lion and tiger, but at least lion and tiger are so behaviorally different that you can come to a very easy answer if you think through it. But yeah,
I'm fine with tie because I think to preserve mine and Mike's relationship, let's just call it a tie for now.
Yeah, I don't see it. I don't see the difference really, except for as a human, I would 10,000 times sit next to a brown bear than I would a polar. Because polars, they live in a desert, right? So if it's alive, they're coming for it. They're coming to see, can I eat that thing? Brown bears, though, like around salmon time, they fight more. And you lived in Sudbury, guys. The guys that fight more are definitely tougher.
Yeah. There you go. Well, that's some points to ponder, Mike. So maybe we'll settle that in the intro or conclusion of this pod.
Yeah, well, like because you said that was too easy of a question. So maybe like through the course of that show, was there ever any matchup where the producers or whoever was putting the show together said like, that's too crazy. That one doesn't make sense. We can't do that one. Was there one that you wanted to do that you weren't able to do just because you couldn't really figure out how this would happen? I guess like what would be your ultimate matchup that you either didn't get to do or would be a better question to kind of ponder as to who would win?
No, we kind of did the obvious ones because, as you say, we're trying to help people that are asking these questions themselves, to give them some fodder. And we always tried to, even though the animated version of our show had a winner, we always left it open. Like there was never a point where we're like, we 100% solved this one. Like in my case, the lion and tiger debate isn't even a debate. Like you've got one animal that fights for a living, the other one tries to avoid fights all the time. Your genetics do not carry on at all unless you're tough. And a lion and tigers, there's a million other things that carry genetics on. But it's like those ones are a little easier in my mind, whereas I get why the public want to know those answers and think that there's a debate. There really isn't. Like you can go on my Twitter probably today and someone's probably posted something about that discussion. But as far as the other thing about that show was always they had to geographically cross just in case they maybe one day could bump into each other. No, I can't think of them. I think the predator versus predator. I think it's when you get into the lighter predators that you can actually have real interesting conversations. Like when you go to something like people love a wolverine, and then you take a wolverine and you say, okay, I'm going to pit that against. It wouldn't go so far as mountain lion, but certainly wolverine and like I say, the biggest eagle on the planet, right? So they're so different. They're going to come at you in so different ways. That's a debate that you can have. Mm-hmm. You can say, well, okay, well, if the wolverine gets a hold of you, I'm like, okay, but that's a big if, because that eagle's just going to sit up top there and only come down when he thinks he's got a talon for the back of your head. So those questions are fun in that way. I think they're more interesting when you can pit technique against technique rather than physical, because the physical abilities and behavioral stuff we know so much about that it becomes a little easier to answer.
And we had to ask you this one, and I know you already mentioned it. When you kind of talked about getting dragged off to the bush by your skull by a grizzly bear, but again, it wasn't. It was a 200-pounder, so it wasn't a huge one. So maybe that's not as close a brush with with death that Steve and I might think it is. Again, if I was dragged off by a 200-pound grizzly bear, I think my life is coming to an end. And obviously in your shows, like you've had close calls with anything from sharks to lions, but is there one that sticks out in particular to you that like you were lucky to get out of that one alive, you know, over all these other encounters you've had?
Yeah, I'd say my first attack was probably the scariest. It was a captive attack. In fact, I don't think I've ever been attacked by one. Yeah, but breezing through different particulars, but certainly the one that sticks out is always the first. First is the one where you're like, holy shit, that's terrible. I was doing a live show at Wonderland, and I was trying to, and we had some little animals in the first half. In the back half, I had a lion and a tiger. The lion got bored, he got possessive of something, and a lion that gets possessive starts to show those behaviors that he would over a carcass, obviously, which becomes dangerous to anything he thinks is a challenge, and I'm his boss, so I'm the challenge. And we end up in a discussion over that. And obviously, being in a park full of 30,000 people, that discussion becomes more and more animated as time goes on. So I had an attack then in front of like 6,000 people. He charged me a couple of times, which is kind of part of the job that you're used to. But then the third charge, he broke my rib cage. And then as soon as as a good predator would, as soon as he realized he had me, the next charge, he went for my throat. And then instead of my throat, I gave him my forearm. He kind of like tried to drag me to the ground by shaking me. Luckily, he didn't get any bone. He just tore the meat out of my forearm. And eventually I was able to let him go back to what he wanted to be possessive over. And I got to wrap my forearm back up and carry on discussing things with him. But that was the one time that I remember it the most, as far as like, oh shit, I'm going to die right now. Like when he had a hold of when those teeth were coming up from my neck, yeah, it was the one moment that in the moment I thought to myself, oh, that's it. This is going to be the time. I'm going to be one of those stupid stories where this idiot decided to become a lion trainer and get eaten. Because when you're young, you think if there's 80% of the people get killed by their lions, you think you're going to be the 20. And then while you're being eaten, you're like, oh no, I guess I was wrong. So a lot of different emotions in that. So like, obviously it was the scariest thing that I can remember, facing your death. And then also you had my life's passion in my eyes. I'm like, well, I can't feel that kind of fear every time I try to like get close to the animals I love so much. So then I had to get over that part of it and really decide, do I want to go back to work? Do I want to call it a day? And there's a lot more emotion in it. Whereas all of the other really close calls, as I got older and better, even though it was a close call, physical contact started to get less and less and less. Meaning, I can see that my life's in danger. There one particular time I was surrounded by a herd of elephants, and intentionally they got in behind me. The matriarch female was threatening us. There was 8 of us, 6 of us. So I knew that if I did the wrong thing, if I didn't get us out of it, not only would I die, but everyone else was going to be killed. And that never became physical, but still also life and death. This is the moment you have to do everything perfect. But as I got older, your brain started to learn how to deal with that later. So in the moment, you're like, okay, focus. I know what to do. I'm confident what I'm going to do. Here's what we're going to do. You talk to your crew, make them do the right things. Go use your body postures and your tone of voice to make sure that female elephant understands what the rules are. And then eventually, luckily, they open a space up and let us get out of there. Then it's 3 hours later when everybody else wants to talk about it. I'm like, if anyone talks to me, you're fired and I'll probably beat you up. Like, leave me alone for the next 3 weeks. Because then your brain starts to think, about those phone calls you'd have to make, or, start thinking about like just all the real situations of if you and all of your crew got killed and whose fault it was going to be. So that happens. So those moments, because they're later, they're easier to digest and therefore less scary. So the lion one would be the one that I digested in the moment, and it was it was something that you don't want to go through more than once.
I can't believe, like, as you're telling that story, I'm looking at myself in the camera and I'm like covering my neck instinctually. like when you're telling that lion story, I can't even handle that.
Yeah, it was a fun one. Like I say, 6,000 people got to watch it. So.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I find it fascinating. Like, so as you get more attuned with your surroundings and with these animals, you're probably having a discussion, like as you say, a discussion or a non-verbal communication with these animals the whole time. And if there's like naive or uninitiated people around you, they don't even know what you're looking at or what you're seeing, right? Like those elephants, you're seeing something happen that you're worried about, and others that are uninitiated around you might not even know that's going on.
Well, just like if you have a dog, all relationships with animals are built on some type of trust, right? So what you have to realize is I have to learn how to communicate. So every single animal I've ever interacted with, I've learned how to communicate with using my tone, using my posture, and using my body language. And obviously, even though you'll see all of my shows, you'll hear me talking, it's the tone in which you hear me saying it that becomes a lot more important than that. So what you try to do is get yourself in a position of communication, meaning you can see me, I can see you. I've now done all my homework. So whether you be a lion, a shark, or an elephant, I know what that means. I know what I'm seeing. I know what the repercussions of that is. And I know what the next step is. All animals will escalate incrementally. They just don't all incrementally escalate at the same rate. Meaning some lions go, and then they come, and some will growl for 3 hours, and then they'll stamp their feet, and then they'll whip their tail. So with all of that being said, it's what you want to do is have an animal sitting there staring at you, watching you, so that you can show them you understand. So I'm here, you growl, now I'm here. Oh, he understood. And I don't have to go and kill him. I told him to go away, and he went away. Okay, I get it. So there's all of those types of things where you can start to positively and negatively reinforce behavior that you're seeing. But first, you have to learn how to see it. Second, you need to learn how to communicate it. So the negative, let's just say, if that elephant's coming in on me, and let's say I've decided that 20 feet is my comfort zone. Anything inside 20 feet, you see me yelling. I'm throwing my hands in the air. I'm making a big stink. The elephant's like, oh, shoot, I don't like that at all. So that's negative. Whereas if the elephant calms down, pulls his ears back, picks his head up a touch, then I'll back off. I start to talk calmly again. I can turn my shoulders. I can sit on my bum. All that just says, oh, that, even there's no animal that doesn't say, oh, he's on his bum with his back turned on me. That's a passive guy. Even though they don't know humans at all, they can look at that and see that. So there's all of those things. As you say, it can look like I'm just sitting out there in the bush. And, oh, he's talking to camera the whole time. But everyone that I'm working with is like, Dave's facing the camera with a pride of lions behind him, and everybody on camera is like, oh, look at that dummy. I'm like, oh, that dummy is doing that on purpose. The fact that you're seeing it and you think that I'm just turning the camera because I'm trying to be Mr. Animal Planet, that is not true. I might be Mr. Animal Planet, but like, I've chosen this moment because they need to hear my voice, they need to see my body, and I'm turning my back on them to say, hey, I trust you, you should trust me. I always put it in terms that people can understand as if you're in the bush and you see a predictable animal, that animal then becomes easier to communicate with and build some level of trust. And people are the same. So if you're walking down the street in Sudbury, and let's say it's 2 a.m. or whatever, and somebody's acting crazy. They're yelling, they're screaming, they're completely unpredictable. You're like, that's somebody that I'm going to give some extra space to because I don't trust them. I don't know what they're on, what they're doing, what mental state they are, and I don't know if they're violent. I do not trust that person. So now I'm going to give that person more space. Whereas if you and I were crossing each other on a sidewalk downtown Sudbury, and I was just walking, looking there, I got my headphones on, and looking at my phone, you'd be like, that's predictable. I know exactly what he's doing. He's on his phone listening to music. I'm going to walk right past him. You can trust me because I was predictable. And then therefore we can share some space together. And that's sort of the same theory with a dangerous animal. You're like, okay, what's the best way to make you comfortable enough that you'll watch me instead of trying to kill me or run away from me? Those two things don't work for me. And then once you start watching me, we're going to build a form of communication. You're going to growl, I'm going to leave. You're going to sit and stare. You want to look around that bush to see me better? Well, I'm going to go stand in a place where you can see me better. All that stuff. So it becomes more intricate than that, but certainly it's the theory.
Mm-hmm. That was a sweet growl, by the way.
Well, Dave, you've been generous with your time, but before we let you go, I did want to ask you one question. So right now, my 6-year-old daughter and I have a bedtime routine where we read a book and then we'll watch an animal video. So it'll be like, what animal do you want tonight? And she'll pick an animal and then I'll find something on, PBS or Discovery, and then we'll watch that. So like every night it's like a snake, scorpion, tiger, like whatever it is. I'm throwing out suggestions. She has her suggestions, but the question I had for you was, what would be your advice like to young people, whether they're my 6-year-old daughter or somebody going into university who has a passion for animals? Like, what would you say to them now? Obviously not everyone's going to go down the same path that you did, but for those that want to keep that, passion going in their lives, what would be any words that you would impart to them?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like from the impetus of your show, saying these unique paths, I think my advice is not to draw your path. Like if you're out there saying I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, then you have failure kind of baked in. If it doesn't turn out the way you wanted it to, you somehow in your heart became a failure and you might turn away from it. So the things that made wildlife less passionate for me was always when it became my job. Meaning, I think when I was in university and I had to learn every genus species of every plant in Northern Ontario, it wasn't as exciting. Whereas now I've forgotten it all and relearning it, it's more fun. It's not my job. So my point to that is, if you're just kind of doing what you're interested in and answering the questions that you have in your head, I think those passion flames burn stronger. If, as you say, at nighttime, your daughter's like, man, like, what does it feel like to be stung by a jellyfish? Even if it's a negative thing, that's a whole path to go on. Mm-hmm. Why do they sting? How does the stingers work? What do they look like? Holy cow, there's one that can kill you. There's one that doesn't kill you. There's one that you get like, I think that it's those questions, because it's my career was that. What do you want to do now, Dave? I'm like, I really think that lions would like me. I think that I could go sit in the bush and hang with them. And what a stupid question. But it's what I was interested in, and I was willing to do everything I had to chase it. And that made it more interesting because I was sitting there with those lions and I'd watch the rhinos interacting. I'm like, oh, wow. What's mittens mean? Well, why is that pile over there? So I guess my point is, if I had told myself, even at fourth year university doing my master's thesis, at that point, you're either your goal probably is get your PhD because it's gonna, or become an area biologist. I don't know what else, my job aspirations would have been at that point, but it really would have altered what the choices I made them less fun probably, because you'd have to do things you're supposed to do rather than things that you're curious about. And it would, I think, limit your path. I think you have unlimited paths if you're like, maybe it'll be my job, maybe it won't be my job, maybe it'll be what I do on my vacation, maybe I think that those maybes allow you to go, I'm just going to chase the things I'm curious. Curiosity is what fuels passion, in my opinion.
What a way to end it. Dave Salmoni, thanks so much for joining us today. I thought that was awesome, and I'm now going to go look up tons of clips of different Animal Face-Off episodes. But thanks so much for being on and being so generous with your time.
My pleasure. And then tonight, I think you should talk to your daughter about vampire bats. And if she's got strong stomach, there's a clip of me getting bit by vampire bats, which I think it's interesting.
Okay.
Good nighttime thing.
There you go.
Yeah, right before bed.
Tee it up, Mike.
Okay, I'll let you know how that goes, Dave.
All right, perfect.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks so much.
Very much.
Well, that was great, Steve. I think, I know that I think he called it a wash when he evaluated our grizzly versus polar bear. And, I think it was interesting that he said, obviously, I think he gave us a point for each of our arguments that, the polar bear, on average, is the largest land carnivore in the world, but, kind of chalked it up to the grizzly is, a little smarter maybe, and is also more accustomed to fighting than a polar bear who's, essentially off in a desert and really only kind of, when it comes into contact with something that moves, it's going to try to eat it. So you've got that advantage, but I
take it as a win. I take it as a win.
Well, I was going to say, I take it as a win. So I think I win, you win. I don't know. Yeah. I think I win and you don't win.
Yeah, that could be it. But here's the thing. The cool thing is that, in having won that debate, I feel that, grizzly bears take down large game on the regular, and you got polar bears who are going after seals and rabbits. Come on. Anyway, I think leaving it a wash maintains our friendship, and let's just leave it at that. I think that it was cool how he talked about that show, how it came up of basically pub conversations, if an eagle attacked a sparrow, or well, that's a bad example, but
well, I think Edge goes to the eagle with that one, but
yeah, maybe.
No, I think it's really interesting because again, I've learned, just to kind of tie in when I talked about how Zoe's into this phase right now where we watch an animal video every night, I've learned so much about animals by watching these videos with her. Like, I'll throw this one out there at you to see if you're aware of this, because it still is part of Animal Face Off. But have you heard of a bee ball?
Oh yeah.
Okay, you have. Okay, so like, I think I'd notionally heard of a bee ball, but I'd never really gone down the rabbit hole of what a bee ball was, right? But what I've learned is, obviously, with Asian giant hornets and like the Asian honeybees, that they don't have the same, defense systems that, North American honeybees would have, but they have evolved to have a higher temperature threshold than the giant hornet. So when a giant hornet sends a scout out to a nest, rather than trying to engage with the hornet, they'll lure it into the nest, and then they'll ball it with all the bees in the hive and basically raise the temperature of the wasp up enough, or the hornet up enough, that it basically roasts, because the bees are able to go just a degree higher, but that's enough to cook the giant hornet. So that's one where the bee ball is a recurring one on our playlist, because Zoe loves the bee ball.
Yeah.
But again, that's something where, again, you go on this journey with your kids or your nephews or whatever, and you never know what you'll learn.
Yeah, wait till you start getting into, I forget the guy's name who gets bit by those things that hurt a lot.
Yeah, didn't he tried to make like an index of like what is the most
Yeah.
painful thing to be like bitten or stung by in the world?
Yeah.
That seems
I think he has a show on Animal Planet.
I think he
But
does
yeah,
too.
I think just tying it back to it shows once again how, the guests we have on, you'd never guess where they're going to end up, but I think another thing that we should mention about all our guests is they all have open minds about their careers.
Mhm.
And I think when you're not too prescriptive, as Dave showed, you could take the core understandings that you get in academia or training, and you can, if you have an open mind, you can sort of end up in a lot of different places. So from going to the pub down under to the set of Jimmy Kimmel, Dave Salmoni is yet another Unlikely Innovator.
Yeah, I was gonna say he's probably literally one of the only people in the world who can say that they did that.
I think probably the only person in the world.
Yeah, I would say there's probably not that many Laurentian alumni who have necessarily had the chance to be on the Jimmy Kimmel show, let alone have enjoyed the refreshments in the pub down under, which I think you and I can attest to as well.
We're halfway there.
We're almost, you know what?
Yeah.
One day, Steve. Let's not rule it out. Let's keep an open mind, as Dave says, and not chart our path, so that when it does happen, we're excited about it. And if it doesn't happen, we haven't failed. We've just haven't made it happen yet.
Well, I'd be lying if I didn't say I wish we'd get there someday.
Oh my.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next week.
The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.